Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. The topic of discussion today, legalization of cannabis in India, is extremely relevant, interesting, and controversial. What India decides today will be reflected on lives of many generations to come. While the discussion needs consideration from multiple disciplines, including economic, legal, and cultural standpoint, we want today's discussion to be centered around health outcomes of legalization of cannabis. Today we have with us experts from field of medical science who have done some of the most profound and groundbreaking research on this topic. I would like to introduce our panel starting with Bertha Madras. She is a professor of psychobiology at Harvard Medical School and has authored more than 200 scientific manuscripts, articles, book chapters, and co-editor of 3 books focused on effects of drug abuse and addiction. She is a recipient of 19 US and 27 international issued patents with collaborators. She also engages in research and relevant to public policy and served as Deputy Director for Demand Reduction in White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, Executive Office of the President of USA. Our second panelist is Deepak D'Souza. He is an active clinician, researcher, and a professor at Yale University School of Medicine. He directs the Schizophrenia Neuropharmacology Research Group at Yale. He has spent 25 years studying the acute and chronic effects of cannabinoids in humans using experimental and observational approaches, and is best known for his work on relationship between cannabinoids and psychosis. Our third panelist is Vikram Patel. He is the Perishing Square Professor of Harvard Health and Wellcome Trust Principal Research Fellow at Harvard Medical School. He co-leads the Global Mental Health at Harvard initiative. His work has focused on the burden of mental health problems, their association with social disadvantage, and use of community resources for their prevention and treatment. He has received numerous awards for his work, and his work was listed in Time magazine's 100 Most Influential Persons of the Year in 2015. Our fourth panelist is Jahan Jammas. He's founder and director, strategy and collaboration, Bombay Hemp Company. Bombay Hemp Company is a Mumbai-based social enterprise engaged in research and promotion of industrial hemp. Jahan undertakes the company's strategic engagements with domestic and international stakeholders. My very warm welcome to all of the panelists. Thanks a lot for taking out time from your busy schedule. And thank you so much for all the knowledge you're going to share with us. The panel will be moderated by Jahan, and Jahan, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Krishna. And thank you so much once again from the team at Harvard and the Harvard India Conference for organizing such a positive and necessary discourse around cannabis. And my special thanks to Dr. Patel, Professor Madras, and Dr. D'Souza for offering their time and their expertise to give their insights from their years of experience in this domain as well. So as a matter of introduction, the way how we'll essentially let this flow is I'll begin by laying out how the entire map of India looks today, whether from policy, whether from research, commercial, culture, history, in a few short minutes. And then gradually I'll hand over to each one of the panelists to get their opinions, and then we can organically let the discussion flow from there. So to begin with, now where does India stand today? Now, as many people know, the history and culture of India has been very intertwined around plant-based medicine and plant-based culture. One of these plants specifically being cannabis. Now, as of today, as per policy and regulation, cannabis in India is regulated by the NDPS Act, or the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act of 1985. But what's interesting is cannabis is only defined as a flowering or fruiting top, excluding the seeds, the leaves, and the fiber. Within the same act itself, there are relevant sections that allow for state governments, in tandem with the central government's guidance, to pursue policies for cultivation of cannabis, both for industrial and horticultural purposes, as well as for medical and research-based purposes. Now, when we refer to the cannabis plant, and as I said, the cannabis flower specifically, that's categorized as a narcotic, the leaves itself are distinguished away, where in India today, the leaves of the cannabis plant are categorized as a Schedule E1 substance, not as a narcotic, but as a potentially toxic substance as per the Drugs and Cosmetics Act of India. Whereas the seeds currently from the hemp or cannabis plants, both low and high THC, are currently considered proprietary Ayurvedic or traditional medicine. And companies like Bohico have actually been working with the Food Safety Standards of Authority of India to notify hemp-based seeds or cannabis-based seeds as food ingredients, keeping in mind their superior health-based properties. But the unique part about narcotics and cannabis in India is the concept or the topic of narcotics itself is a concurrent list item. That means state governments have certain prerogatives to mandate their own policies, laws, and rules, allowing for cultivation of cannabis, for example, but in accordance with certain guidelines laid about by the central or the union government. Now, over the last 8 years at Buhiko, we have worked with almost 7 state governments to help them formulate policies right from research to commercial grade cultivation. The first actual policy that came into effect was back in 2016 from a hilly state in India called Uttarakhand or Uttaranchal, where a cultivation policy for low THC, that is less than or about 0.3% THC, particularly focused around the fiber and the seed for industrial application, came about. But since 2016 to 2020, there's been significant change. Currently, there are about 5 state governments finalizing medical cannabis cultivation policies. And that has been very strong, I would say, soundly and strongly echoed by the way India voted in favor of rescheduling cannabis at the CND meeting, that is the Commission on Narcotic Drugs meeting held in December 2020, along with countries like Thailand and Nepal, that actually led to the larger macro rescheduling of cannabis from a stricter schedule to a relatively lighter schedule for exploration for medicinal purposes. But that is the first part of the story. The second aspect of what's been actually occurring in India is there has been a huge amount of fundamental research that has commenced over the last 8 years. Research that has begun with plant breeding and plant-based research that is currently companies like Buhiko have tied up with organizations under the Department and Ministry of Science and Technology for research-based cultivation in 2 to 3 states in India using domestic cannabis land races, almost 250 of them, to identify how their cannabinoid limits work, their seed, their flower, their leaf, their fiber quality, etc. works, with a view to be able to scale this into a greater controlled agriculture cultivation, as compared to the paradox that India is in today, where there is cannabis growing everywhere, but there's no marker to identify what cannabis it is in the first place. So that is where a lot of foundational research began. But over the years, we've seen that there has been enormous interest from the medical health and the scientific community of India to learn and understand more about where cannabis leaf, flower, and its, I would say, its excipients stand on different scales. That's why over the last few years, we've been fortunate enough to engage with institutes like the Tata Memorial Center, in India's Apex Cancer Research Institute, as well as the National Institute of Ayurveda, on human grade open label single arm studies to establish cannabis's efficacy for a range of indication areas, including rheumatoid arthritis, as well as exploratory studies to understand the genetic expression of cannabis vaporized in a vaporized form on stage 2 breast cancer patients. In fact, I'm very happy and pleased to share that the Drug Controller General of India and the CDSCO during this time of the pandemic actually provided this approval for Tata Memorial Center to undertake India's first ever human grade clinical trial in a modern medicine setting, in partnership with the Bombay Hemp Company, as well as in partnership with the Dutch Ministry of Health, to be able to access a good quality materials to be able to conduct such clinical studies on their patients. And this is similarly been matched up by LD50 animal toxicology studies at the Indian Institute of Toxicology, as well as the right kind of platforms to be able to speak about relevant learnings across scientific and medicine mediums. For example, India hosts a medical cannabis summit hosted by Buhiko in partnership with our government partners every 2 years. The last few editions have seen the Drug Controller General of India, as well as the Minister of State for the Prime Minister's Office as chief guests, sharing their opinion and favor towards cannabis's exploration for medical and therapeutic application, as well as medical experts from some of India's top institutes like AIMS, NIMHANS, and TMC as well. Now, the beauty of all of this coming together is it isn't only about the fiber, the seed, only about the flower or the leaf. There is also tremendous research happening with the fiber to explore it for textiles with the Indian Institute of Technology and the Ministry of Textiles. And working the larger ecosystem around hemp and cannabis has been where Buhiko first began as India's first ever industrial and medical hemp organization, where today we've worked successfully with upwards of 10 to 20,000 customers and patients patients. We work with almost 50 to 60 plus different doctors, both from modern and ancient medicine settings, several policymakers, several state governments, and scientific institutes such as CSI institutes to breed, study, analyze cannabis to be able to show its safety, tolerability, toxicity, and efficacy in different clinical settings, so that the conversation of cannabis moves from an anecdotal mindset to a much more clinical, more analysis-based mindset. And since we began, the industry itself has grown in leaps and bounds, where when we began we were the only organization, but today there are almost 55 different organizations in India, with one coming up almost every single day. And today the market size is estimated at about 100 to 120 million dollars, which of course pales in comparison to the North American climate and environment. But for us, we consider it a stepping stone and a gradual learning uptick in the process. But what really is happening in India, and this is sort of the last part of what I'd like to share, when it comes down to the commercial, historical, and social belief of cannabis's use in India, it begins with the leaf. That is what we call bhang in India, where centuries old Ayurveda, ancient medicine, and several texts, such as the Charak Samhita, have actually spelled out about 100 different herbo-mineral formulations where the leaf, that is bhang, and the seed of the cannabis plant has been used for a variety of indication areas. But under these texts, can bhang or the leaf is still listed as an upavisha, that is a semi-poisonous group of drugs that possess ashu, or a quick property to act. But while going through the texts and while analyzing this, several ancient medicine experts came to an understanding that almost 41 rasa granthas, or that Indian alchemical texts, as well as 26 chikitsa granthas, that were texts related to treatment protocols from ancient medicine, have had mentions of the leaf of bhanga being used in several herbo-mineral formulations, majorly focused around several of its existing properties, whether it's deepana in Sanskrit, or the digestive stimulant, whether it's panchana as a digestive, whether it's ruchya as a taste promoter, madakari as a potential intoxicant, vyavi in its short-acting nature, medhya in its memory booster, or even rasayan as an adaptogen property. Now, along with this, with the flowers and the leaves, a lot has been said about the pharmaceutical development that's happening, and similar pathways are being pursued for other CSIR institutes and DBT institutes. And as has been seen through a lot of research, that India is one of the largest recreational cannabis consumers currently present out there. But what is making this conversation and topic point all the more pertinent is, before India takes its next leap into the great unknown of cannabis policy and regulation, whether it's the leaf being used in ancient medicine, the flower being used in pharmaceutical development, or creating policies that are conducive. This platform proves pertinent to hand over to the experts and several of the prestigious academic minds who have actually seen the growth of the North American industry firsthand, and be able to provide an insight in the process. What I'll do is I'll quickly stop here, and I will lead on to our panelists, starting with, of course, Dr. Vikram Patel. And of course, Dr. Patel, my first question to you is, what is your view, keeping in mind your line of sight, on the prevailing discourse and developments regarding decriminalization or legalization of cannabis, both in the United States and India?
So thanks a lot, Jahan. So first of all, I'm going to be very empirical in my point of view. I think it's important not to let ideology or commerce actually be the drivers here. The only driver must be the foundation of science of human health in this instance, because that has been the primary justification for the laws for or against cannabis, whether it's good for you or bad for you. These are always couched in health terms. And so I'm going to really restrict myself to those particular narratives. The first question to ask ourselves is, what is the evidence on the dangers of cannabis? The second question to ask ourselves is, what has been the cost and the benefit of extremely prohibitory policies on cannabis? That means to say criminalization of cannabis. And thirdly, is there any evidence of alternative regimens that can actually, to varying degrees, liberalize the use of cannabis without actually incurring the harms that we're concerned about? I'm going to give in a nutshell the answer to each of those broad questions. But I think it's also important to remember is that we cannot see the use of a substance without some understanding of the broader social, cultural, historical context. I'm not going to go into that right now, but you've already alluded to that. But I think pretending to see issues of human behavior and the consumption of substances in a way that is completely divorced from history, culture, and tradition is actually mindless in my mind. But anyway, let's just focus on the science for now. The question of how dangerous, I think overwhelmingly, I believe the evidence clearly points to saying that cannabis is not in the same class of addictive substances as, say, for example, the opiates are, in terms of the fact there is very little evidence of tolerance. There's very little evidence that when people cease the use of cannabis, they encounter significant withdrawal symptoms and so on and so forth. So I don't believe that cannabis falls into the same bucket as some of the other narcotic drugs that are prohibited under the same law that you mentioned in India. I think what is very clear, though, is that there are vulnerable individuals, and I guess some of the other panelists will speak to that. There are certain vulnerable individuals and vulnerable age groups in which the use of cannabis, particularly certain kinds of cannabis, the very potent forms of cannabis, and I'll circle to that in a moment, can be harmful. But that is like saying that almost anything in life can be harmful in certain age groups and certain vulnerable groups. So it isn't a damning indictment of cannabis. It's just a recognition that there is never a binary when it comes to psychotropic substances. It's not, is it safe or not safe? It's a question of who is it safe for and in what circumstances is it safe, and similarly, who is it not good for and in what circumstances is it not good. To the second question about the cost and impact of prohibition, I think the general evidence on this front is, and this is not just about cannabis, this is actually about policies and substance use more generally, is that, again, these are ideological divides as well, but I'm going to try and restrict myself to the science. There's precious little evidence, I believe, that, criminalizing cannabis and indeed also other substances actually leads to overall societal benefit. There's no question, obviously, that there will be a reduction in the population use of the substance if it's criminalized. But there's a counterfactual that one has to take into account when one looks at, for example, the criminalization of vast numbers of people, the incarceration of vast numbers of people. In India, we don't see it to the same extent as we do in the US, but there is an enormous societal impact of that. There is an enormous personal impact of being criminalized. You have a cannabis, you're stuck in a prison. What impact that does to your life chances, etc., is incalculable. So I think when you do a cost-benefit analysis, actually, in my view, it's a complete no-brainer that the criminalization of substances like cannabis actually incurs a far greater societal harm than it does a benefit. And finally, what are the alternative regimens and what evidence are they that they offer a different path of thinking about this? The great news in the last 30 years is that many countries, and in the US, many states, have begun to experiment with alternative approaches. And these can range from decriminalization, the use only for medical purposes, to full legalization. And I think the general observation at this ecological level of states and countries is that there is no uptick that one sees in terms of the harms associated with cannabis. You certainly see an uptick in some places with the use of cannabis, but no corresponding uptick in, for example, the numbers of people who are appearing with psychotic conditions in emergency rooms and so on. And I want to just end with one thing, a word of caution. While all that I've said is generally true, I don't think it excludes the fact that certain kinds of cannabis, and I want to circle back to the earlier point, are actually quite dangerous. And I think to actually have a conversation about cannabis without thinking about the types of cannabis, the dosage of THC in cannabis preparations is a bit like talking about alcohol without recognizing that there's a vast difference between beer at the one hand and pure ethanol at the other. I think that there is evidence that the very potent forms of cannabis that are gaining more and more of the market share in parts of Europe and the US are actually are far more toxic in terms of the psychotropic effects than the cannabis that grows on mountainsides. And I think we do need to have a continuing scientific inquiry about the question about the safety of certain kinds of cannabis versus other kinds, in the same way that there are graduated laws on drinking. For example, the laws on beer use, the laws on wine use, and the laws on spirit use, and certain alcohols are totally banned. I think that kind of much more nuanced conversation is needed when it comes to cannabis, not an all or none, or not yes or no. I'll end by saying, Jahan, this is why bhang in many ways has been, it's legal, which is a paradox, right? Because bhang is also psychotropic. It has THC, but it has very low concentrations of THC, number one. Number two, it is very much connected with traditional cultural practices. And so I think that demonstrates that there are ways in which one can construct a law that doesn't criminalize people who use cannabis, but still acknowledges the harms with certain kinds of use and certain kinds of cannabis, and restricts the use of those forms.
Thank you so much for your opinion, Dr. Patel. I believe that you raised some very valid points and valuable points, which we'll continue to explore during the course of this discussion. I'd like to quickly hand over to Professor Madras. Professor Madras, you've been working at the forefront of drug policy development with extensive learnings about drug abuse across different narcotics, psychotropics, of course, including cannabis. Wanted to understand from you about your point of view on the discussion around cannabis, whether in North America and the upcoming discussion in other countries, and perhaps if you could share your insights and learnings on that as well. I'm sorry, Professor Madras, you're on mute. If you could kindly unmute yourself.
Thank you very much for having me. I would like to summarize some of my perspectives from the point of view of my own personal journey and professional journey through this entire field. It began essentially by developing a museum exhibit in the Boston Museum of Science in 1991, when I encountered, we were trying to summarize the effects of all drugs and each category of drug, and I encountered tremendous pushback on the part of people who were partnering with me in development. They asked me and pressured me to say nothing negative about marijuana. And I realized that there was an emotional component to the support of marijuana. Fast forward to being in the White House as the deputy drug czar for demand reduction. And under those conditions, I had tremendous access to a vast database of number of users, of consequences, and in terms of medical consequences, social consequences, different age groups. The federal government in the United States collects through many different venues, tremendous amount of statistics. And on peering at these statistics, I came away with a very strong impression that the consequences of marijuana are definitely on the ledger of adverse as opposed to benefit. And so that began to shape some of my ongoing evolution in terms of thinking. Then fast forward to my service on the World Health Organization, in which I was asked to write a summary of the medicinal uses of cannabis. And as I wrote the summary, I said to the committee that commissioned me, I'm going to say nothing except what the science says. And when I realized after extensive research that through meta-analysis, through a number of epidemiological, medical studies, randomized controlled trials, and so on, the evidence on whole plant marijuana, as opposed to isolated cannabinoids, and we know the cannabinoid plant has at least 104 cannabinoids, the evidence was very weak with regard to whole plant marijuana as a medicinal drug in terms of what our own Food and Drug Administration requires in its very stringent process for drug approval. At the same time, the US Department of Justice asked me to represent them in a landmark case in California on rescheduling marijuana from Schedule 1, which is the most restrictive, to Schedule 2, or descheduling it altogether as a safe and harmless drug. And in order to prepare for that case, once again, it required a tremendous amount of research on the literature. And what was clear to me is that rescheduling marijuana was impossible based on the definitions of the schedules. Because if you reschedule marijuana into 2, 3, 4, and 5, which are the schedules for drugs with high abuse liability or moderate abuse liability and medical purposes, the scientific evidence for randomized controlled trials, for large enough database, for every single disease state that it had been approved of via ballot initiative in the US, there just wasn't. What doses, what frequency, what were the pharmacokinetic properties, and so on. And in that landmark case, the Department of Justice and myself, I was the sole expert witness for them. We were opposed by 7 expert witnesses on the other side. The Department of Justice won. And they won unequivocally that this is not the time or place to reschedule marijuana. We fast forward to a panel at the Vatican Pontifical Academy of Sciences. And here we segue from the hard, cold data into the social, the political, the spiritual component. And it was very clear that a number of people on this panel from all over the world, we were represented from Sweden, from South America, very heavily in Latin America. There was strong opposition for a number of reasons to focus only on opioids and not include marijuana. And the final summary statement, which is available online, clearly had a negative approach to the marijuana. And then finally, I served on the President's Opioid Commission. And during that time, we asked the public to submit requests and recommendations for what recommendations we should make. There were thousands of recommendations from marijuana users saying that the way to solve the opioid crisis was to legalize marijuana or medicalize it, nationally as opposed to state by state. And from that experience, I once again looked at the literature. What does it say about the substitution of marijuana as an analgesic over opioids? And the literature just simply did not support that as a recommendation. So in summary, what I can say unequivocally is that at this point, what we know with certainty is that at least 75% of people who are using marijuana for medicine are also using it recreationally in several studies that have been done in the country. And I'm just going to give you bullet point headlines of what are the concerns for people who are working in the field. Number 1 is the consequences of high potency. Number 2 is youth drug use. Number 3 is pregnant women and what the data say. Number 4 is what parents say when children live at home and their attitudes and their use of the drugs. Number 5 is what are the consequences to young adults. Number 6 are the predisposing conditions that Dr. D'Souza has wonderful experience with. Number 7 are some of the medical side effects. And number 8 are the concern of opioids versus marijuana. And then finally, I would close with Canada, because it's legalized marijuana, has recommended a number of guidelines for individual users. And there are about 9 or 10 guidelines. And if you look at the number of people who are following the guidelines, those guidelines are not working. They're certainly not working in states that have medicalized or legalized marijuana in the US as well, because youth are not supposed to have access, but clearly they have tremendous access, because in states that have medicalized and legalized marijuana, youth use is much higher than states that have abstained from it. Finally, we have the criminal justice component. And from my point of view, my perspective is arresting people and putting them into jail for personal possession is not a wise way to address the problem. But we know with absolute certainty that if you reduce supply, you reduce use. If you reduce supply, you reduce access, use, and consequences. And the consequences of marijuana use in the United States, in Canada, are mounting rapidly. In the United States has the most number of addicted people per unit population. Addiction is a very difficult thing to treat with regard to marijuana, and I can discuss every single component of that. But those are topics that I think we should get into during the panel discussion.
Most definitely. Thank you so much, Professor Madras, for sharing your insight and opinion. I think what we'll do is we'll quickly hand it over to Dr. D'Souza. Dr. D'Souza, you've been extremely experienced on the ground, both in clinical and anecdotal settings, and have seen sort of firsthand how this rising THC and the rising concentration of cannabis and marijuana products in North America, what potential adverse events or effects that they've brought along that perhaps conventionally we may have not set our eyes on. So if you could provide us your view, particularly from the domain of mental health psychiatry, and of course with your working experience around cannabis and the present discourse as well.
Thanks for inviting me and having me. I don't think I have much to say. Professor Madras said it all, but I'll try and add a few things here and there. The first is that I think, no pun intended, but we need to really weed out the issues related to legalization, because I don't think the issue is really legalization. The issue is commercialization. And that's unfortunately what is often missed in the discussion about legalization. I think all of us would agree, most reasonable people would agree, as Professor Madras said, that putting people in jail for possession of marijuana is not a good idea. And we recognize this in the US, especially in the US, because minorities really got the short end of the stick. And so it is a social justice issue in the US. But I would argue that there are many social injustices that India needs to deal with than the criminalization of marijuana. To me, the issue is really about commercialization. And why is that important for us to consider as India considers legalization? Like cannabis, tobacco and alcohol have been used for centuries. But the game changer was commercialization. The morbidity and mortality associated with tobacco and alcohol rank amongst the top 10 of global disease burden. Tobacco, like cannabis, was initially touted as a natural and harmless plant that was safely used by South Americans in religious ceremonies. The tobacco industry invented cigarettes for ease of use, altered the acidity of tobacco to make it less harsh, added other chemicals to improve its taste, mass-produced cigarettes and sold them with sophisticated advertising. The tobacco industry manipulated knowledge about the adverse effects of tobacco despite being aware of these effects, and successfully staved off legal battles for decades. No amount of taxation of the tobacco industry can compensate for the health toll on billions of tobacco users over the last century. Likewise, alcohol. So despite knowing the risks associated with smoking, cigarettes remain legal and the tobacco industry continues to thrive, and in fact has focused selling cigarettes in India and China, the two largest populations. So this also highlights the point that once the genie is out of the bottle, it's hard to put it back in the bottle. So is cannabis safe? You heard from Professor Patel that there's no evidence of tolerance and withdrawal. I would argue, and I'm sure Dr. Madras would agree with me, that there is very compelling evidence of tolerance seen in animal studies, in humans, in brain imaging studies, And DSM-5 now finally recognizes cannabis withdrawal as a significant cause of a morbidity that interferes with people's ability to quit using cannabis. Cannabis is addictive, there's no question about it. And the cannabis that was available in the 1960s, or the cannabis that's available in India, is very different from the cannabis and the cannabis derivatives being sold in the US. The cannabis in the 60s in the US had a THC content of 4%. The cannabis currently available in the US has a THC content of, the average THC content is 17% and continues to climb. And there are a number of cannabis products that have 80 or 90% THC. Now, this has not happened by accident. And India needs to wisen up and understand that this is exactly what's going to happen in India. Because the truth of the matter is that people want the most powerful of these drugs available. And so the industry has likewise successfully engineered these plants. You'll be told that cannabis is natural, it's a plant. How can it be harmful? Well, so is cocaine, so is tobacco, so is heroin, all plant-derived products, which are associated with considerable harm. Now, I don't dispute the fact that cannabis is used in social and cultural settings. In fact, as you might know, in 1961, driven by Western nations, the UN sponsored an international treaty to ban the production and supply of drugs and narcotics. And India resisted and negotiated exceptions, loopholes, and deferrals before finally succumbing to international pressure in 1985. It is ironic now, 35 years later, that as the West is legalizing cannabis and other drugs, India is following suit, or at least considering following suit. So there's nothing natural about cannabis. The cannabis plants that are being used in the US are genetically engineered to produce very high amounts of THC and very little CBD. I want to talk a little about the harmful effects of cannabis. There is fairly compelling evidence of an association between cannabis and psychosis. As you know, we don't have any modifiable factors for schizophrenia or psychosis, with one exception, which is cannabis. There have been some studies done in the UK suggesting that about 16% of new cases of psychosis may be related to cannabis. And if we can prevent even 5%, that would be a pretty good thing for us to do. The issue of medical marijuana. I serve on the Physicians Advisory Board for the state of Connecticut's medical marijuana program. And I have to tell you, in reviewing the evidence, that at least for psychiatric conditions for which marijuana is also listed in many states, there's not a shred of evidence that one could defend the use of medical marijuana for things like PTSD, anxiety. And I would argue that the list of medical indications for which cannabis has been touted in many states across the US, there is very, very little evidence. In fact, when you think about it from a scientific perspective, why on earth would cannabis work for irritable bowel syndrome, PTSD, psoriasis, and the 38 other conditions which don't have any common pathophysiology? This doesn't make any sense. What cannabis may be doing is what alcohol does, which is it takes the edge off, may make people feel less anxious, make people feel more calm, but there's no good evidence to support the notion that cannabis has any effects on the pathophysiology of any of these diseases. So in terms of risks related to cannabis, let me quickly enumerate them. Dr. Madras did go over those, but I'd just like to go over those again. Acutely, the effects of cannabis include impairments in memory and other cognitive processes, including ones that are critical for scholastic activities and also critical for driving motor vehicles, things that we need to be concerned about from a public health perspective. The long-term or regular use of cannabis may lead to addiction. There's no question about it. Tolerance, dependence, withdrawal. Old data suggested that just 1 in 10 people would develop cannabis addiction. Recent data using sophisticated epidemiological studies like the NISARC study show that it's closer to 3 out of 10 people, or 30% of people will develop cannabis addiction. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, it means that a person will spend too much time and money and effort getting high on the drug, procuring the drug, recovering from it, and trying to quit using the drug. Regular use of cannabis has also been associated with long-term cognitive impairments, problems with memory and attention. And as I mentioned earlier, cannabis has also been associated with the development of schizophrenia, depression, and anxiety disorders. Lastly, brain development, which, as you know, continues until the age of 25. There is emerging evidence that exposure to cannabis in adolescence and young adulthood can lead to long-lasting issues with brain development, because the brain has its own endocannabinoid system, which, when perturbed by external use of cannabis, can be disruptive, as you might know. So I would say that if India is considering legalization, what India might carefully consider is to decriminalize cannabis the way that many states in the US have done. But I would suggest that India continue to forbid commercialization of cannabis the way that for the reasons I've suggested previously. Because what is the purpose of commercialization? The purpose of commercialization is to sell your product and to sell as much of it and to make as much money as you can of it. The tobacco industry realized very early on that the young user is a lifelong user. So it's not by accident that in the US, there's an array, a dazzling array of products that are aimed for young people, children, young adults, edibles that are like gummy bears, Klondike bars, and so on and so forth. These are just thinly veiled attempts to hook young people, because the idea is that young people will become long-term users of cannabis and cannabis products, and this will drive the revenue of profit-motivated companies. So I'm going to end on that note. Hopefully, I've made my case that that India has some options, and the options I would suggest would be decriminalizing marijuana.
That's a great point, Dr. D'Souza. And I think, in fact, I noticed a common thread amongst all of your opinions. And I think it points to one key fact. That is what we refer to as the McDonaldization of cannabis, where it's about big, fast, cheap, and has high concentration as high power as possible, which, as Dr. D'Souza elucidated, comes in many different forms in North America, whether it's edibles, gummies, vaporizers, some of which have actually begun to show hazardous, I would say, health effects. I remember reading a study about the concentration of benzene in vapes and dabs that can contribute to early stage cancer. And I think, that leads me back to a key question in terms of, and perhaps you can start with Dr. Patel and Dr. D'Souza and Professor Madras, that keeping in mind India is at an early stage. And as you said, there's this huge mountain that the United States and Canada have overcome, but with a lack of retrospective data to say that, okay, 25, 35, 45% THC is actually causing damage, cannabis emesis, psychosis, a wide spectrum of indication areas. How does a policymaker or a bureaucrat align both these interests, keeping in mind that today it is technically not federally legal in the United States, but there's still growing concentrations at a supply end through the increased capitalism and corporatization? How do governments and policymakers maintain safeguards and control in such a way that such resources can be allocated majorly for territories like its medicinal or limited therapeutic effect, where it would actually have more enhanced value, rather than just being sort of on offer at higher levels, and the India being in a position where the United States or Canada is in maybe 10 years from now dealing with high THC problems and sort of adverse event offsets. So maybe Dr. Patel, we can start with you, and post that Dr. D'Souza, if you would like to, and Professor Madras, if you'd like to share your opinions.
Sure. Thanks, Jahan. I think the most important lesson that we should draw on is that we should not confuse science with politics. The US is a very poor exemplar of drug control in the world. In fact, it's probably one of the worst examples. The US is a peculiar country where opioids have killed more people in the last 10 years than all the rest of the world combined. And it is because of a very peculiar collision of the medical industrial complex that actually is very, very potent in the US. I mean, it is not, and I think one thing we should be careful about is not to follow the US approach, that swings from criminalizing young African-American men in the 70s, that swings from that to this ridiculously permissive approach on cannabis that actually treats it like as if it's something you can just buy along with your green leafy vegetables. It is this swinging from one end to the other that actually we should completely reject. What we need is a balanced, graduated approach. Many other countries show us a far better approach towards the management of substances other than the US. For example, Portugal. For example, the Netherlands. Yes, not all of them have been successful in every single goal, but God knows they've been far more successful than the US has been. So I think India needs to look elsewhere for its role models. I definitely agree that the more potent forms that are now dominating the US market is something we should absolutely stop from coming into India. If there was anything that we should be legalizing or decriminalizing, it is the homegrown, as it were, organic cannabis. It's interesting and peculiar that actually in a world where organic products are beginning to be priced at a higher level, synthetic cannabis products, they're almost synthetic because they're actually not grown wild, they're grown in these greenhouses and hydroponic labs, that those are actually dominating the market in the US. They're more toxic, they're more lethal. I don't completely agree that it is the case that people want more toxic products, because if that is the case, I don't know why anyone would drink beer or wine. I don't believe that there's a natural correlation in that. I do agree that the marketing of more toxic products, the marketing to young people, is a particularly dangerous aspect of commercialization. Certainly, there are models like, for example, in Canada, all cannabis procurement, sale, distribution is entirely 100% controlled by the government. Of course, within that, you have a whole range of different varieties of cannabis. There's a huge amount of transparency. When you buy cannabis in Canada, you are told exactly what the THC concentration is. There are limits to the strength of the THC that you can sell. So there are these other models, Jahan, and I think we need to be inspired by other models. We neither want to criminalize entire chunks of young people. I think that is something I've heard both my co-panelists talk about. But equally, we don't want to sort of glamorize and pretend that cannabis is safe in the same way that alcohol isn't safe, tobacco isn't safe. And indeed, to be absolutely blunt, many foodstuffs that we eat are not safe, including virtually every beverage that has sugar added to it. So I think to pretend that life is filled with these binary choices is a false question. I think it's a far more important question to ask is, who is it safe for? How should it be used? And what should be prohibited? And I think in my mind, it's very clear that certain kinds of cannabis should be prohibited, but not all kinds of cannabis.
Wonderful. Perhaps we'd like to hand over quickly to Professor Amadras or Dr. D'Souza, and then post that we can quickly hop into questions from the public.
Yes, I would like to just address some of the issues. The problem with commercialization is that in the United States, it's very difficult to rein it in once the train has left the station. So that with regard to commercialization, every effort at the state level to limit the potency of marijuana has failed. There's not one state that caps the potency. The issue of whether or not people want more potent or whether or not it's driven by the industry is a very interesting one that has been looked at. And I have to temper what Dr. Patel has said on this. There are very clear choices that people make to take the most potent drugs. And some of the strongest resistance from capping the potency comes from the users themselves. In the same way that crack cocaine, in the same way that methamphetamine ice, in the same way that spirits as opposed to wine or beer have captured a certain population, primarily people who are addicted. The industry very much likes to have high potency THC because they are taxed on units sold. The higher the potency, the taxes are lower. And the higher the potency, the more people they can capture into addiction. And I think that's really important to recognize. So both from the point of view of the producer and the user, there is a pressure on state legislatures not to cap. As to the Canada, the Holland, the Portugal models, Holland has capped the potency. But what's interesting is that in Amsterdam, marijuana is still sold at over 10% THC. And it has been estimated that approximately 50% of the people with schizophrenia in Amsterdam can be attributable to marijuana use of high potency and very frequent use. So we still, and this is a wonderful multi-center study, multi-city study that was published very recently. I don't think that Canada's formulation is working as well as it should, because there is now data showing that every recommendation they've made to the public with regard to education has not been followed in terms of multi-substance use and so on. And we have not even begun to develop any conversation about all the adverse consequences. Dr. D'Souza have referred to some of them. There are far more that can be described in great detail, including the fact that most people who use marijuana, especially potent marijuana, are using multiple substances, including the fact that use of marijuana under the age of 18 is the highest risk factor for developing addiction to opioids. There is tremendous crossover on drugs. There's tremendous polypharmacy with regard to drugs. And people who use marijuana are much more likely to use alcohol and tobacco and to become addicted to it. So the crossover of drugs is something, and as I said, I haven't even begun to touch all the scientific literature on adverse consequences for the purposes of time and not crowding out other speakers.
Thank you so much, Professor Madras. I think we have time for one quick two questions. I think we'll start with Dr. D'Souza. You had mentioned one question we've received from the public viewing is, if could you clarify how cannabis can take the edge off and help a person relax, but ultimately how it doesn't fit the physiobiological models of PTSD? If you could offer us some of your insights from your perspective, and of course, Dr. Patel, if we could get some of your insights from your point of view as well.
So the most common reason why people use cannabis is to chill out, to relax. That's, that's pretty well known. The problem is that when people repeatedly use it, it can set up a cycle where when they don't use it, they will get anxious. And because they get anxious, they will be forced to use it again and again. And so it becomes very hard for them to quit. While there's been anecdotal evidence that cannabis may help with PTSD, when you actually look at the data, there really isn't a shred of evidence to support the notion that cannabis helps any of the symptoms of PTSD. In fact, there are studies that are showing quite the opposite, including some studies done at Yale, where those with PTSD actually who used cannabis had bad outcomes relative to those who didn't. So the relationship between cannabis or cannabinoids and anxiety is a complex one, because cannabinoids can have biphasic effects. They can have sometimes anxiolytic effects, and in some cases anxiogenic effects. Just like they can have antiemetic effects, and they can cause hyperemesis. They can, across the spectrum of effects, cannabinoids can have biphasic effects. And so using cannabis to treat anxiety is probably not a good idea.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. D'Souza. Dr. Patel, if you would like to offer any insight on this point in particular.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I don't think we should be treating cannabis in a medicinal way to treat mental health symptoms. You know, I do see, I think what I've heard both my co-panelists speak is exactly what I agree with. It's not about cannabis. It's about the potency, the age, It's about the pattern of use. And I think, again, I would stress this applies to virtually every psychotropic substance. There's nothing exceptional about cannabis that I've heard. And in fact, on the case of, all the sort of negative effects, I think one has to look at proportionality here as well. And I think it's about creating a kind of a sensible, balanced approach rather than, veering between two different extremes.
Absolutely.
The only thing I like to add to that is that many people have made the comparison between alcohol and cannabis and tobacco and cannabis. And I think making those comparisons based on information about a kind of cannabis that we don't have anymore, as in cannabis that has 3% THC, is very different from the cannabis that we currently have. So when people say that individuals use cannabis don't get addicted to cannabis to the same extent as alcohol, well, that's because the data that was collected with cannabis that was very weak. We know from animal studies and human studies that the potency of cannabis will drive addiction. And so the higher the potency of cannabis, the greater the likelihood that you're going to get addicted to it. And that's what the numbers are currently showing, that in the US, at least in the NESARC study, which is one of the largest epidemiological studies, 3 out of 10 people met criteria for DSM-4 cannabis use disorder.
That's a great point, Dr. D'Souza. I think, this is sort of a very sort of a contrary standpoint to where India stands today, as mentioned, where because it's the start of the curve, we have an opportunity to not pursue such high potency, where the levels of THC you mentioned are approximate levels that still exist in natural growing cannabis today, which provides maybe a unique opportunity for medical experts and regulators to assess this at the scale, be able to provide a pathway for its medicinal therapeutic approach such that it doesn't get McDonaldized into the recreational point of view, in line with what yourself and Professor Madras were also sharing as well. I think there's one question here about how the Ayurvedic formulations use cannabis, which I think I'll be happy to answer. Currently in India, they are licensed and legally allowed to use proprietary Ayurvedic formulations with the cannabis leaf, albeit in predefined proportions, with preclinical concept studies, with labeling requirements, and under prescription by ancient medicine doctors. So it has been and it is accessible to a wide spectrum of patients who are looking at alternative complementary medicine therapies as well. And going forward, the anticipation is to be able to build a system that normalizes the limits existing of cannabinoids and the content within produce today, and not be able to touch the upper end limits and marks that are seen in North America, where the health risks seem to turn towards a much more untoward direction as well. I think what I'll do is, unfortunately, we're running short on time, but I'd like to quickly pass it around for a final quick 1-minute thoughts from Professor Madras, Dr. D'Souza, and of course, Dr. Patel, before I sum this up and we conclude our session for today.
Thank you. For India, I would, above all, beg caution, because the US experiment is a human experiment without informed consent. People are not aware of the potential hazards. They are comparing alcohol with marijuana, and for example, smoking. Those comparisons are false comparisons, because each drug in and of itself produces different adverse consequences. Nobody gets intoxicated with nicotine, and yet you can die of lung cancer. Nobody gets drunk usually on 1 glass of alcohol, and yet with 10 glasses of alcohol, they can damage a fetus. There are so many false narratives that are being used to promote marijuana, and I urge India to try their best to ream out what is real good science, quality science, from talking points that have been developed over the past 40 years to promote this drug in terms of commercialization. The best example we have of a legal drug that went awry are the opioids. Opioids were tightly regulated, unbelievably tightly regulated in terms of chain of custody, production quotas, who can get prescriptions, and yet the country, with all its regulatory oversight, lost complete control of opioids, and now we have the worst overdose crisis in our history. Now, marijuana will not give an overdose, but it will become out of control once commercial interests set in. And I caution India to be very, very circumspect in their policy in the future.
Thank you so much, Professor Madras. I think to sum it up, since we're running short on time, first of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Vikram Patel, Dr. D'Souza, and Professor Madras for offering their time. I think the key that we've learned, the key takeaway is as India moves forward with its policy, it has to be based on sound science, on safety, tolerability, toxicity, efficacy, using RCTs and clinical settings to evaluate how cannabis can contribute more positively to the public health, the healthcare system in India, where we encounter challenges that are paradoxical and unique. For example, we produce the third largest amount of opium in the world, but there's practically inaccessible problems and constraints with opiates for patients in cancer or palliative care in India. So I think the key, the summary is exercising caution, exercising wisdom, building out policies that do not criminalize consumers, but provide them a healthcare alternative and initiative to realign their lives, and most importantly, have the right clinical and scientific setting for how cannabis should be explored, whilst taking away the harsh learnings and lessons from the United States and other countries as well.
Excellent.
Thank you to all our panelists and viewers for joining us today.
Thank
We have a
you.
lineup of interesting panels you can see on our website. Please visit our website to find Zoom links for the panels. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for your time, everyone.